to address. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. It's a privilege to be here to address this august audience at the close. I'm thankful to General Naval. The first session was all quite exhaustive, and I have been given a subject to discuss, a stable Pakistan, about which perhaps as a debater I would myself have some doubts, but I'll take it on regardless. A lot of what has been said will be discussed in overlap, and I believe that there were some inaccuracies in assessments and facts, which I'll try to point out as I go around, but this is my take on what factors will govern a stable Pakistan. Firstly, what are the historical factors conditioning stability? Now we all know Pakistan's state's quest for identity, the insecurity bred by partition, inadequate share of military spoils, failed attempts on Kashmir, 47. Incidentally, the first coup attempt was not in 49, but in 1951. It was known as the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. The failed constitution-making experiment, perception engendered in the military and in the bureaucracy of inadequacy or contempt for politicians frittering away the time and mandate, which led to the successive military regimes. Then 71 brought out the failure of the two-nation theory, the emergence of Bangladesh, the talk of revenge and partition, unfinished agenda of partition ever after. The army emerged, and this has been pointed out in all the presentations, as the supreme defender of the country's ideology, integrity and institutions. This was an external threat-driven role to buttress internal cohesion. This is a phrase my friend, distinguished Ambassador Sood, gave to me, and I used it in this presentation. But to go to other academics, Christine Fair recently in her book has talked about Pakistan being a purely greedy state driven by ideological motives. What have been Pakistan's security parameters? Again, this has been discussed. Opposition to Indian hegemony, deep-rooted insecurity arising from history I have just spoken about. Kashmir, the K of Pakistan, the unfinished agenda, the use of non-state actors, and the asymmetric option to make it relevant to us that you can't wish us away on Kashmir. Then nuclear deterrence, the quest for the Islamic bomb, eating grass, as the famous book by Farooq Feroz Khan, serving retired brigadier of the army, Pakistan Army. Military control over nuclear policy, the Strategic Forces Command, the rejection of no first use, deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. The primacy of defense requirements, which is 28th in the world, 19th in terms of sheer military expenditure, these figures have been quoted. Acceptance of outside assistance for defense, primarily from the USA, China and North Korea. Then identification with conservative Islamic causes, again this has been spoken by General Imam, or belief, taqwa, fear of Allah, jihad fi sabilillah, fight in the cause of Allah. The benefits of geography or location which have helped Pakistan stability. It was a staging post in the Cold War, pro-US against USSR. The Gary Price incident brought this out way back in the early 60s. The historical role, 71, it proved to be a secret bridge for US outreach towards an isolated China, which served them in good stead later. Brought out most graphically in the recent book, the blood telegram, is it? Or, yeah. There it is emphasized again and again how useful it was to Pakistan. Then, to cast itself as the frontline state against Soviet invasion into Afghanistan in 79, escalation of US aid, both military and economic. To project itself, its utility as a moderate Islamic state, as a bridge between the Arab Middle East and the southeastern Muslim states, Malaysia and Indonesia particularly. This has again been a card which has been used by Pakistan time and again. Connect between South Asia and Central Asia. It's still trying to project it through the CPEC also. Then the emergence of Gwadar, overseeing sea lanes, oil transportation routes, Straits of Hormuz. This fits into China's economic corridor project. They say that they don't have a string of pearls, so we'll accede to that temporarily. But we must acknowledge also the democratic experiment. There was such an experiment, it is still an experiment going on. And I would say that it's a failed, it's not perhaps a failed, it's a faulty democracy, but it is a democracy still. So these are the various phases: 73 to 77, 88 to 99 interim, the ouster of Benazir, Nawaz Sharif's ouster twice, Charter of Democracy signed between Nawaz and Benazir in May 2006 when both were in exile. The lawyers' movement for restoration of judges is another phase. The 2008 elections were held without army interference, despite disturbed law and order conditions and assassination of Benazir. Musharraf was forced to quit as a result of the judges' restoration agitation. Burgeoning media freedoms, ironically, the lasting positive contribution of the Musharraf dispensation. And the passage of the 18th Amendment, a significant step, finances to states, devolution of subjects. Incidentally, I don't agree with Savita's assessment that this was helpful to the army. 18th Amendment has not been helpful to the army. The 2011 electoral mandate, again, the Nawaz Sharif Muslim League coming to power with a sizable majority. Provinces, this is the factual position, already flagged in earlier sessions. But the agitation of Tahir al-Qadri and Imran Khan, which was launched last year, brought governance to a standstill. And there was an expectation of army intervention, but it did not happen. It came close to the brink, but it was because of the Javed Hashmi expose that the army perhaps had second thoughts about what Imran Khan expected them to do. The present situation, unfortunately, now PPP is in disarray, the MQM is being attacked, and the PTI suggests that it is the ruling party in waiting. But in actual fact, perhaps PMLN still remains the only fact party that could matter. But the army has defanged it. Coming briefly to the traits and proclivities of Nawaz Sharif. Though originally a creation of the army, he managed to successfully move from the army's apron strings to cast himself as a mass-based leader. This is what happened in the mid-90s. He has sizable business interests and he roped in both Punjab and Sindh feudals to support these interests. Every time he was elected by a popular mandate, an authoritarian streak in him came to the fore. This was accentuated after the 1990 elections and again in 1997. This led to troubled relations with the army because of his penchant for dabbling with army posting, seniority, post promotions, etc. And then Musharraf became his bete noir. Again, this has been pointed out by Savita. He was rehabilitated with Saudi help, returned from exile before the mandatory ban period had expired. Now, after the 2013 mandate, there was an expectation that there would be a new maturity in him. Whether this has been belied, I am not still sure, but in the selection of the new army chief, this was done on the advice of one of Nawaz's ministers, under whom Rahil had served twice as chief of staff. And I don't believe that Rahil is the most anti-Indian general. Every chief has to be anti-Indian, and it is not merely because Rahil's brother was a martyr in '65. In fact, there are many indicators to point out that Rahil is more balanced, sensible, and not India-centric, except perhaps recently, lately, when they have had other reasons to, come out openly in Core Commanders Conference against Indian agencies. But there are different reasons for that. Now, after Imran Khan's dharna fizzled out, Nawaz Sharif's PMLN has had an easier relationship with the army. This also became evident in the new army chief, the ISI chief's appointment, where the army view prevailed. There have been questions about a shift in the civil society ambience. Now, there is definitely an acknowledgement of this during the period 2008 to 2013. You can say this was an interregnum, but this was a period when politicians stopped running to the army for every little thing to bail them out. And the post-Musharraf withdrawal of the army from the civilian sphere under General Kiani was welcome. But things started going wrong with the following. One, Kiani extension as army chief after 2010. It was not popular within the senior army generals' votary, who wanted the next army general to get his piece of the cake. There were two major hiccups. One was Abbottabad, when the ineptitude of Kiani and Pasha was highlighted and berated even within the army about not being able to, prevent the American arms to come in the way and kill Osama bin Laden. Whatever the conspiracy theories which had emerged later, there was this problem for both Kiani and Pasha. Then the second blip was the Memogate issue, when Hussain Haqqani, as the serving Pakistani ambassador to USA, advocated pressure to prevent further army coups. He also suggested intrusive nuclear curbs. This incensed the army, and Hussain Haqqani had to go. But there was one other issue during this period, that the judiciary was instigated to act against the PPP government. There were contempt of court cases against both Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani and Parvez Ashraf. But the government survived. In fact, there was a counter-offensive against the then Defense Secretary General retired Naeem Khan Lodi. So whether this, how genuine or how permanent has been this shift in civil society, in this context I would like to flag the role of the judiciary. There was newfound judicial activism, jettisoning the doctrine of necessity under Chief Justice Iftikhar Chaudhry. This activism has ebbed, in my view, after 2013, but an uncertainty remains. This was again mentioned by Ms. Pandey, over the role that the judiciary will adopt on the 18th Amendment issue and the 21st Amendment issue, on both of which there are petitions pending before the Supreme Court. There was pressure on the army through disappearance cases in Balochistan and revival of hearings in the Asghar Khan case. Nothing much happened after. The Musharraf trial. There were ramifications of the army as an institution. They didn't like it, and they slowly maneuvered to a position of inaction where it hangs as a sword of Damocles over Musharraf's head, but Musharraf is fairly sacrosanct and nothing much would come of the civilians' determination to push him further into a corner. And the fact remains that despite a hostile judiciary and an army in the last 3 years of their tenure, a weak PPP government survived its full tenure. So this is actually a factor which supports the concept of a stable Pakistan. Now, judiciary and terrorism, there is an issue I'd like to flag. The judiciary remains scared or conservative in response to terror trials, which is something we must understand. There is no witness protection and there are poor conviction rates. There are open threats from terrorists to judges about which the state has not been able to do anything much about. So when we judge the role of the judiciary, we have to keep this in the back of our minds. Dealing with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Now, there was this resolution in 2009, but nothing happened. There was anti-American sentiment in civil society, which is slightly abated now. The army had serious concerns on their counter-insurgency operations in FATA since 2003. Then Kiani and later on Rahil, they have taken the domestic terror threat more seriously. And after Peshawar Army School attack, there has been a consensus with strong civil society support to tame the TTP. And this has been done to a certain extent in Zarb-e-Azab, though the view is valid that top TTP leaders may have escaped northwards into the mountains or Afghan safe havens, perhaps to return later. And there is poor progress in rehabilitation of IDPs, which does not seem to be a military priority. So it raises some question marks. Coming to the larger issue of army and Islam, the army had to face serious attack by Islamic radicals on its headquarters, and the involvement of the Punjabi Taliban with the TTP shook up the generals. And also the continuing phenomenon of attacks by the TTP on Frontier Corps in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, there have been cleansing and purges in the senior echelons of the army which have been ongoing post-Zia, in vetting of promotions, etc. It's not a new thing. There was the failed Abbasi coup attempt in September 94, and the exposure of the Hizb ut-Tahrir penetration by a brigadier level officer and some others in August 2012. They were punished under a military tribunal. This also shook up the army top leaders. There was the Mehran naval base attack, the Salim Shehbag killing after the penetration story, after his story on the penetration of Islamists in the Navy. And later, last year, the abortive claimed Al-Qaeda attempt to board the PNS frigate in the Karachi harbour, ostensibly to attack Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. So there is the phenomenon of latent radicalism in civil society in Pakistan and within the security establishment, which is a persisting concern for the army. but for the moment they seem to be confident of handling it. To talk of the post-Peshawar National Action Plan, now there are many hurdles and gaps in this. 9 military courts were set up, and as I said earlier, the issue of the capacity of army to summarily hold trials or execute terrorists has been questioned. The Bar Council, we had public litigation, interest litigations are there, and the execution has been stayed by the Supreme Court, but no final verdict has yet come. The real issue is the propagation of a convoluted concept of jihad, where the civil society or generally the preachers, the Islamic clergy in the society, they say jihad to kill is justified in the concept of Quran or concept of Islam that Pakistan now seems to follow. And there is a continuing commitment of non-state actors to this ideology. There are also growth of linkages both with the Al-Qaeda earlier and now with the IS, though the Pakistani state seems to be uncomfortable with accepting the spread of IS or acknowledging the spread of IS in Pakistan, and it is perhaps not that serious a threat as of now, to refer to General Chakravarti's question from the first session. At the Karachi Defence Expo speech in December last year, Rahil Sharif reiterated that the main threat to security is from supranational forces of disorder. He sort of coined this new term, supranational forces of disorder, but he was referring to non-state actors, and he did speak about determination to eliminate them without discrimination. Though here again I feel that the army is soft-pedaling any effort to discipline or braid the Lashkar-e-Toiba. There are conflicts within the senior army leadership. How far to go against the good terrorist? The army chief may have been forced to react against perceived Indian bellicosity when the corps commanders made a direct reference to interference by Indian agencies. Just a word about the economic dilemmas. This has been dealt with in great detail in Dr. Rajiv Kumar's paper this morning. But as I said, he also brought out about the structural imbalances, a poor tax collection base, remittances have been the bailout, poor GDP growth rate, foreign aid dependencies, heavy market borrowings, high defense servicing, debt servicing 49% of total revenues. My figures may be slightly inaccurate, but I am not an economist, so I have just taken a sort of bird's eye view of this. And there are inadequate social sector allocations which have been the problem in Pakistan. Nothing for public health, education and water supply issues, virtually chronic poor performance in the power sector. The investment climate remains bad due to a disturbed law and order situation, especially in Karachi. But Wagner and the massive Chinese aid bailout seems to have infused new confidence among Pakistani security establishment. So what remain the army's concerns or priorities today? One, to ensure that there is no undue interference in their prerogative to chart out or control key security foreign policy parameters, especially against India, on Afghanistan and on nuclear policy. These are the three sacred cows. So second thing is they would not like to brook any interference from the political leadership in army or ISI postings, and Nawaz seems to have accepted this. Third seemed to be limit the civilian capacity or attempt to seek undue retribution from the army of past mistakes. So there again, there seems to be a temporary restraint on part of the politicians. Fourth seems to be to limit judicial overreach, especially as regards scrutiny on the disappearance cases in Balochistan. Secondly, to put a handle on media freedoms. This was very succinctly brought out in the Hamid Mir case. I am not going into details for paucity of time. So, a new civil-military hybrid has evolved. Savita referred to this. Apex committees are now overseeing various aspects of the National Action Plan Against Terror, and meetings are being held with the provincial chief minister, with the leaders at the local level, where army officers are presiding and deciding on the agenda. So this is the new civil-military hybrid that seems to be going on. And this has led to a tightening of the noose against corrupt politicians, especially of the MQM and PPP in Karachi. The Zardari speech of June 16th, which was referred to in the morning, where he threatened to expose army corruption, was perhaps a blip or a mere bravado on his part, just to signal to the army that please don't go so far, and we can do something, but I have my doubts as to how effective PPP can mount a response against this. So army-dominated short-term stability seems to be, and weak political drift seems to be the order of the day in Pakistan. Now in this context, you see, I would like to flag what is known as, what I have called the sweeping under the carpet phenomenon. This is something the army and the establishment in Pakistan has always done. So, regard to the political transition, today there is a democratic facade. There is a controlled drift. Whether this will continue up to the next election in 2018, I cannot say for sure. Then there is an economic transition, which is foreign aid, remittances and market borrowings dependent. It will remain this way. There is an Islamic transition, but there is a reluctance to reverse the narrative of radicalization, to touch the education corruption, the curriculum, to do madrasa reforms. So there is what I call a diffident political will to tackle terror or radical Islam. Instead, there is cosmetic, force-generated, selective and calibrated repression of terror. Control, penetration of radical ideas within the security establishment, as if this will be the panacea for all evils to end. So this can only be a recipe for short-term stability. Paradigm change is needed for, I'm just finishing sir, long-term changes, forcing the army to retreat from the civilian sphere of governance. Portents for the future, army remains powerful. There is disdain over civilian malgovernance. And the signal is that the army could come back to direct control if civil society condones this role, or the vigilance of civil society weakens. Any transformation in this picture will evolve slowly from within, through institutional processes, which will they squeeze the military space for political maneuvering or proclivity to perpetuate its own perks? I don't have the answer. But there is a need to avoid what is called or described by Pakistani analysts as Egypt on the Indus syndrome, to develop and orchestrate all elements of national power, as military will no longer then be the sole custodian of security, and the civilian politicians could play a role. This is a hope more than expectation. So what then are the implications for India? We have to engage with whoever is in power, monitor carefully the dynamics of shifting power equations between diverse centers of power, army or civilian. There can be no hope, and there should not be in India, of any positive movement, especially on the trial of the Mumbai 2611 accused. We should expect continued use of the asymmetric option, deploying non-state actors in Kashmir or elsewhere, instigation, sustenance of links with IM sleeper cells, activation of AQIS or IS links inside India. But of course, appeasement should not be the answer, but we should eschew, in my view, verbal bellicosity and muscles flexing. But this will not get us anywhere with Pakistan. Instead, we should focus on enhancing homeland security, better use of positive or negative levers to influence strategic calculus, expedite police reforms, better intelligence cooperation, home quick capabilities for covert action. Thank you.